Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is James Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 14 wide receiver rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses thus far this season on average are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into Week 14. After which, I'll transition into talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual wide receiver, while also presenting statistics in order to justify these overall rankings. Before we get into today's content, a couple reminders. If you're looking for a specific wide receiver, there are timestamps down in the description of the video. While you're down there, if you enjoy the content and of course appreciate the timestamps, be sure to click the like button. It's greatly appreciated. And if you've yet to do so already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season for the singular purpose of trying to help you capture a 2023 fantasy football championship. Thank you very much for all the support. Let's talk about wide receiver matchups going into Week 14. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we have 2023 wide receiver receiving statistics allowed. So I've gone ahead and isolated receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns in a half PPR scoring format on top of the spectrum of time between weeks 5 through 13 in order to determine the most advantageous matchups. As you guys can see, the Philadelphia Eagles, Washington Commanders, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, New York Giants, Jacksonville Jaguars, etc. are at the top of this conversation. So of course, wide receivers like CeeDee Lamb, Brandin Cooks should have themselves a great performance against the Philadelphia Eagles. The Washington Commanders, of course, and their Arizona Cardinals, unfortunately, on a bye week. But Drake London hopefully have a bounce-back performance against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It's all within the realm of possibility. Now, these are the most advantageous matchups. Let's talk about some of the more disadvantageous matchups going into the given week. As you guys can see, teams like the New York Jets, the Denver Broncos, Baltimore Ravens, New Orleans Saints on the very bottom of this conversation. Even though these are some of the more disadvantageous matchups and they allow the fewest wide receiver fantasy points per game on average in a half PPR from weeks 5 through 13, there are still opportunities for wide receivers to have great performances against these defenses. I mean, just recently, Nico Collins, in the absence of Tank Dell, had a huge performance against the Denver Broncos secondary. A couple weeks back, with the Black Friday game, of course, Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle had themselves huge performances against the New York Jets secondary. So again, there are going to be performances and there are going to be wide receivers that can go against the grain, go against difficult matchups, and still put together fantastic performances. So keep that in mind. I'll refer back to these statistics over the course of today's episode. Let's go ahead and transition into talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings. Before I do so, a reminder, rankings are always subject to change between now and Sunday morning when I live stream from 7 to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Again, answering questions for the entirety of the 3-hour live stream. Be sure to swing on by if you have any questions. Of course, the rankings that I present here today are definitely going to change by the time we get to Sunday morning. Again, guys like Christian Watson, who we're not 100% certain as to whether or not he's going to be healthy. Other players like Amari Cooper, who's in the concussion protocol. There is going to be a lot of information that is presented to the public that absolutely will adjust the rankings, whether it is, wide receivers injuries or potentially secondary members. A cornerback that is going to be missing definitely makes a huge difference in terms of the potential of our wide receivers. Now, for those of you who won't be able to make it to a Sunday live stream, you can also go ahead, travel down to the description of the video and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit, minimum of $10, not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match up to $100, but you'll get my rankings sent to you from my email directly to yours for the remainder of the season. All you got to do, again, is sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10. These rankings are by position, by tier, flex rankings, half PPR, full PPR, all-encompassing rankings to help you guys out for the remainder of the season. It'll be sent every single Sunday morning from my email directly to yours. Be sure to check your spam folder, and I'll also be sending out rankings Saturday of week 15 and Saturday of week 16 because, again, there are Saturday games for the NFL taking place then. Thank you very much for all the support. For those of you who are wondering if you could take advantage of the opportunity, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. And on top of it, for those of you who signed up before Thursday's game between the Pittsburgh Steelers and New England Patriots, you can take advantage of the pick'em slip of 0.5 total yards and Najee Harris. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, let's get into talking about some wide receiver rankings, beginning with our number one, Tyreek Hill. So besides the fact that Tyreek Hill is 484 yards away from breaking Calvin Johnson's record for the most receiving yards by a wide receiver in a singular NFL season, thus far this season, he leads all wide receivers in terms of total touchdowns scored. On top of that, he has scored 1 touchdown in 10 separate games this season. On top of that, has had 100 plus receiving yards in 8 different games this season, leads the National Football League in that statistic as well. He's coming off a performance of 20.8 half PPR fantasy points, takes on the Tennessee Titans, which is a top 12 matchup at the position. Should be a fantastic week for Tyreek Hill. Number 2, we have CeeDee Lamb, another one of these wide receivers who's playing absolutely incredibly. He's coming off a performance of 26.6 fantasy points in a shootout against the Seattle Seahawks. In that game, was able to set a career high in terms of total targets and receptions, 17 targets, 12 receptions, $116 receiving, and a receiving touchdown. of course, continues to ball out, especially down in the red zone, as he's become one of Dak Prescott's favorite receiving options outside of a Brandin Cooks. Jake Ferguson down in the red zone, of course. CeeDee Lamb continues to dominate. He has scored 7 total touchdowns in the last 6 weeks. Of course, we're going to fire him up, especially against the Philadelphia Eagles, the most advantageous matchup at the position. A couple weeks back, Week 9 against the Philadelphia Eagles, 16 targets, 11 catches, 191, 22.6 fantasy points. Most recently, the Philadelphia Eagles have given up 12 catches for 206 and 4 touchdowns to San Francisco wide receivers. And of course, 15 receptions, 226, and 2 receiving touchdowns to Buffalo Bills wide receivers. A lot of stats. CeeDee Lamb should have himself a fantastic performance. On number 3 is Mike Evans. Mike Evans is getting it done every single week. He just most recently surpassed 1,000 receiving yards for a 10th consecutive season. This future Hall of Famer continues to ball out regardless of who plays at quarterback. You would have thought that going from Tom Brady to Baker Mayfield would have made a huge difference. Yeah, the difference is apparent, and the fact of the matter is he's playing better with Baker Mayfield. Thus far this season, he's been able to score a receiving touchdown in 9 of his 11 healthy games. He continues to put up incredible performances. Most recently, 3 of the last 4 games, over 22 fantasy points and a half PPR scoring format. Takes on the Atlanta Falcons this week, back in week 7 against their defense, 17.2 fantasy points. We're expecting another big performance here, especially if, in fact, the secondary of the Atlanta Falcons, who's dealing with a couple injuries, are not going to be intact. Mike Evans should be able to take advantage of the opportunity. Our number 4 for this week is Keenan Allen. Of course, we know that Keenan Allen last week was dealing with an injury going into the contest against the New England Patriots. Also, he was dealing with the fact that the weather in that game wasn't ideal. Nonetheless, was able to come away with a performance of 8.3 fantasy points, 9 targets, 5 catches, 58 yards. In comparison to what we have seen most recently out of Keenan Allen, that is a huge disappointing week. But from weeks 10 through 12, he had set a standard. Throughout that entire 3-game span, he had himself 100 plus receiving yards in each of those 3 games and 10 plus receptions in each of those 3 games. So of course, we're hoping that he's going to get back to that overall streak. I'm expecting that to be the case this week, taking on the Denver Broncos secondary as the number 1 wide receiver of the Chargers offense. Moving on to our number 5, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now, similar to Keenan Allen, Amon-Ra had a quiet week in week 13, only 11.9 fantasy points, only 2 receptions for 49 receiving yards, 1 receiving touchdown, and only 6 total targets. Now, obviously, it had to do with the fact that this team took an early lead and were running the ball for majority of the second half, but we would love to see far more opportunity going in the direction of Amon-Ra St. Brown. This is the fewest receptions he has had in a game all season long, and on top of it, this is the fewest receptions he has had since week 6 of 2022. So very seldom do we ever see Amon-Ra St. Brown get a lack of opportunity in this overall circumstance. This week, they take on the Chicago Bears. The last time he took them on was given an ample set of opportunity. 11 targets, 8 catches, 77 and a touchdown for 17.7 fantasy points. And the last time they took on the Bears, Jared Goff threw 3 interceptions. So imagine if you score on those possessions and put together some production with Amon-Ra St. Brown. I'm expecting him to have a huge week here against the Chicago Bears. Our number 8 for this week is Michael Pittman Jr. Michael Pittman Jr. is playing out of his mind. He's coming off a performance in week 13 against the Tennessee Titans in which he tied a career high of 16 total targets. 16 targets, 11 receptions, 105 through the air, 1 receiving touchdown in overtime to seal the game. He's been able to get himself 8 or more receptions in 7 of the last 8 games he has played with Gardner Minshew as the starting quarterback of this organization. He's never scored less than 10 half PPR fantasy points with Gardner Minshew as a starter and has an opportunity of taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars secondary, who is the 5th best matchup at the position, allowing over 32.5 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. I'm expecting another big week here for Michael Pittman Jr., who continues to put up great performances. Again, if you're going to run shallow routes like he has, and you're going to get yourself 8+ receptions every single week, full PPR, he's even more valuable for those purposes. Moving on to our number 7, we have AJ Brown, another one of these stud wide receivers that is an automatic start, coming off a performance in which he, most recently has gotten back on track. Unfortunately, the result against the San Francisco 49ers wasn't ideal, but the overall production was. Considering they were in a negative game script and they had to throw for majority of the second half, 13 targets, 8 catches, 114, we'll take that every single week, especially going up against the matchup this week against the Dallas Cowboys, in which this should be a shootout, hopefully, between these two teams. The last time out in week 9 against the Dallas Cowboys, AJ Brown, 9 targets, 7 catches, 66 and a touchdown. Just last week, his former college teammate, DK Metcalf, had himself a career day of 6 catches, 134, 3 touchdowns. Hopefully, we can get similar numbers from AJ Brown in this circumstance. My number 8 for this week is Stefon Diggs. Prior to his bye week in week 13, in week 12, took on the most advantageous matchup at the wide receiver position, taking on the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, of course, was able to have himself a solid performance, scored himself a touchdown, double-digit fantasy points, but we have to hope that he can take that momentum, go into the bye week, get healthy, and prepare himself for week 14's contest against the Kansas City Chiefs to put together a huge victory here, because for the Buffalo Bills, this is a must-win scenario. In order for them to go ahead and make the NFL playoffs, they have to string together a lot of victories here, and it starts with the Kansas City Chiefs. If you look back in 2022's contest against the Chiefs throughout the regular season, Stefon Diggs in that game, 13 targets, 10 catches, 148 and a touchdown for 25.8 half PPR fantasy points. We're hoping for a huge volume of opportunity going in the direction of Stefon Diggs and for him to continue his momentum of success coming off that Eagles performance. Moving on to our number 9, we have Ja'Marr Chase. Like I mentioned in the back end of Monday's waiver wire episode, as I typically do on Mondays, I put together a couple pick'em slips at the end of the episode for the Monday Night Football game. The 2 suggestions that I made obviously hit, but nonetheless, we were talking about Ja'Marr Chase potentially going over his overall reception and receiving yard count. And I was hoping, and I was saying, hopefully Jake Browning is going to utilize him in the screen game, similar in which they did with Joe Burrow when he was injured against the LA Rams. Hopefully they're going to use him on short yardage opportunities, just get the ball into his hands and let him make plays. And that's exactly what they did. They started out, even though he wasn't gaining a lot of yards early, was able to get the ball in his hands, get him a little bit of momentum, and later in that game was able to get himself a nice catch and run and score himself a touchdown. Of course, when you're able to give an elite wide receiver of the caliber of Ja'Marr Chase 12 targets, 11 catches, 149 and a touchdown, the 12 targets there is the biggest number. It's the most important number. Opportunity leads to success, especially when you have a high caliber wide receiver like Ja'Marr Chase. Now, this upcoming week, they take on the Indianapolis Colts. Most recently, we have seen number 1 wide receivers dominate in the given matchup. DeAndre Hopkins this last week, 5 catches, 75 and a touchdown. Mike Evans the week before, 6 catches for 70 and 2 touchdowns. I'm expecting Ja'Marr Chase to continue that momentum and have himself a great performance here against the Indianapolis Colts secondary. Moving on to our number 10. We have the return of Justin Jefferson, hopefully this week. If Justin Jefferson doesn't return this week, I will be surprised, especially considering he has been out for like 8 weeks now. Justin Jefferson back in weeks 1 through 4 prior to his injury was averaging 12 targets, 8 catches, 136.75 touchdowns per game. So scoring 3 touchdowns in every 4 games, 21.7 half PPR fantasy points per game. We're hoping for a productive week here. Most recently, wide receivers against the Las Vegas Raiders, guys like Rashee Rice, 8 catches, 107 and a touchdown. Tyreek Hill, 10 catches, 146 and a touchdown. Garrett Wilson, 9 catches for 93. Amon-Ra St. 6 catches for 108. Wide receivers have put together great performances. We're hoping for the elite nature of Justin Jefferson to elevate the performance of Josh Dobbs and hopefully elevate our fantasy teams for the rest of the season, because we truly do need them to help us capture a 2023 fantasy football championship. Moving on to our number 11, we have DJ Moore. DJ Moore has been playing incredibly well when Justin Fields is the starting quarterback. Thus far this season, in the last 6 games with Justin Fields, DJ Moore has scored 6 touchdowns as a member of the Chicago Bears. Not only that, in 5 of those 6 games, he's been able to produce 96 or more receiving yards. Now, when we look at those last 6 games that he's played with Justin Fields, and we even isolate the 45-point performance he put up against the Washington Commanders on that Thursday night, when we even exclude that overall performance, DJ Moore is still averaging 16.82 fantasy points per game with Justin Fields. They take on the Detroit Lions this week. Going back earlier this season, of course, had himself an incredible performance within that overall matchup. And on top of that, the Lions thus far this season are the 6th best matchup at the wide receiver position, allowing 31 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And we know the only wide receiver that's really going to catch the ball within this offense is DJ Moore. He's primed for a big week here. Moving on to our number 12 to close out the wide receiver 1 overall conversation, we have Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel is coming off of another performance of a rushing touchdown. He has scored a rushing touchdown in 3 of the last 4 games he has played. This week they take on the Seattle Seahawks, one of the more advantageous matchups at the position. Of course, we most recently saw last Thursday, guys like CeeDee Lamb, Brandin Cooks have themselves incredible performances. But just go back a couple weeks, week 12, Thanksgiving Day. The Seattle Seahawks took on the San Francisco 49ers. In that game, Deebo Samuel had 9 targets, 7 catches, 79 receiving yards, 15 overall rushing yards on 4 attempts, 1 rushing touchdown, 18.9 fantasy points. We're hoping for another big performance here from Deebo Samuel against the division rival. Moving on to the other half of this overall conversation in regards to, of course, the San Francisco 49ers putting up great performances from their wide receivers against the Seattle Seahawks, we transition to Brandin Aiyuk. Brandin Aiyuk, over the course of the last couple of weeks here, has just been extremely efficient and, of course, consistent. In the last 5 consecutive games, he has had 12 or more fantasy points in every single one of those performances. Not only that, but most recently against the Seattle Seahawks on Thanksgiving, had himself 2 receptions, 50 receiving yards, 1 receiving touchdown, 12 fantasy points. Of course, we would like to see him get more than 2 receptions within a given game. You go to the overall performance against the Philadelphia Eagles, 7 targets, 5 catches, 46 and a touchdown. He's pretty much going to score himself a touchdown guaranteed. He's going to get himself the receptions, the yardage. He's going to be over, 12, 13 fantasy points at a base minimum. He's always got the potential of scoring even more, getting more yardage, making plays after the catch. Nonetheless, a dynamic player who's going to continue to ball out. Moving on to our number 14 to close out the B tier, we have Davante Adams. In the last couple of performances in which we have seen Davante Adams play with Aiden O'Connell, weeks 10 through 12 prior to the bye week, 33 total targets. Again, that's a lot of opportunity, 11 per game. Only 18 receptions, 6 per game. Again, the overall, target share that he's getting, incredible, but when he's not able to make majority of the receptions, the question that comes to mind is, are those targets really of value when you're not able to catch majority of them? Nonetheless, when I go ahead and look at Aiden O'Connell's overall passing attempts as a starter this season, he is on target 71.5% of the time. That's a pretty good number, especially when you take into account there are a lot of quarterbacks that are significantly below him. And thus far this season, he's actually playing pretty well. So even though the overall targets, 33, have only led to 18 receptions in the last 3 games, Davante Adams is still averaging 13.03 half PPR fantasy points per game. We're hoping for another big performance here against the Minnesota Vikings as the number 1 receiving option in this offense, who is going to continue to get himself an elite level of opportunity. Moving on to our number 15, we have Chris Olave. Obviously, we're anticipating that Derek Carr is not going to be able to clear the concussion protocol. If in fact that takes place, Jameis Winston will be the starting quarterback. If you go back to 2022, Chris Olave's rookie season, throughout the first 3 games of the season, Jameis Winston was the starting quarterback prior to his injury. Throughout those 3 games, he targeted Chris Olave 29 times. He was the most targeted wide receiver on the New Orleans Saints throughout that span of time. And not only that, we have seen on multiple occasions this season in games in which Derek Carr gets injured, Jameis Winston has to come in. He immediately looks in the direction of Chris Olave for success, and they continue to find that. This week, they take on the Carolina Panthers. In the last 3 games of Chris Olave's career against the Carolina Panthers, these are his overall performances. 11 targets, 6 catches, 86. 12 targets, 5 catches, 60 and a touchdown. 13 targets, 9 catches, 147. He has gotten himself 11 plus targets in each of the last 3 games against the Carolina Panthers. Pete Carmichael, the offensive coordinator, makes it a point to get the ball in his direction in these overall matchups because he continues to find success as he'll continue this week. Moving on to our number 16, we have DK Metcalf coming off a performance of a lifetime. 6 catches, 143, 3 receiving touchdowns. An unbelievable performance of 34.4 half PPR fantasy points. In the last 4 games, he's been able to garner, 38 total targets. He continues to get himself the number 1 opportunity on this offense. Now, as we kind of progress, we're going to see far more utilization out of JSN, but it's not going to impact DK Metcalf negatively. The only thing that really holds him back this week is the overall matchup. Takes on the San Francisco 49ers, a couple weeks back against the matchup Thanksgiving Day. 9 targets, great opportunity, but only 3 catches for 32 receiving yards, 4.7 fantasy points. We have to hope that he could put together a performance very similar to his former college teammate, A.J. Brown, which he got himself, 7 catches, 114. If we can get similar production out of DK Metcalf there, that'll be a fantastic performance. Moving on to our number 17, we have Nico Collins. Look at the overall route tree that Nico Collins was running. I mean, these are only the routes he was targeted on, but he did get himself a lot of targets in the absence, of course, of Tank Dell. Obviously, broken fibula out for the season. Nico Collins going forward is the de facto number 1 of this offense, for sure. Coming off a performance of 12 targets, 9 catches, 191 and a receiving touchdown, an unbelievable week of 29.6 fantasy points. Again, when you're able to put up as many fantasy points as Tyreek Hill within a given week, you had yourself an explosive overall performance. Nonetheless, he takes on the New York Jets this week. That is the toughest matchup at the position. But most recently, we haven't really seen great wide receivers take on this defense. We've seen just this last week, the Atlanta Falcons wide receivers combined for 1 catch, 8 yards against the secondary. But Miami Dolphins wide receivers, 17 catches, 116 and a touchdown. We saw, of course, Buffalo Bills wide receivers, 7 catches, 142 and a touchdown. Las Vegas wide receivers, 9 catches for 112. We have to hope that CJ Stroud continues to look in the direction of Nico Collins for the entirety of the game, despite how difficult the matchup is and the coverage from guys like Sauce Gardner in that overall scenario. Moving on to our number 18, we have DeVonta Smith. Now, I've talked about it ad nauseum over the course of the last 3 weeks. In the absence of Dallas Goedert, DeVonta Smith is an elevated player, gets far more opportunity. In the last 3 games, without Dallas Goedert, has been able to put up performances of 20.1, 12.9, and 20.1 fantasy points. Incredible overall games, going over 20 fantasy points in 2 overall games over the last 3 weeks. We would hope that even in the return of Dallas Goedert, we'll continue to see the same level of opportunity go in the direction of DeVonta Smith, but again, I think that's wishful thinking. Nonetheless, he was able to put up, back-to-back games of a touchdown. On top of it, 90-plus receiving yards in each of the last 3 games minimum. This week, they take on the Dallas Cowboys back in Week 9 when Dallas Goedert was active in that game. DeVonta Smith put up 12.6 fantasy points, found the end zone. We are expecting that Dallas Goedert does end up returning this week as he was a full participant of practice earlier today, Wednesday. So my anticipation is we'll probably see far less opportunity going in the direction of DeVonta Smith, but we can just hope maybe he can stay active, continue to get himself double-digit targets, and hopefully continue to be a top 20 option at the wide receiver position. Moving on to our number 19, we have Courtland Sutton. Just look at the 7 targets that Courtland Sutton got on Sunday. Everything is 20 or more yards down the field. That is, I've literally never seen this in my entire life outside of wide receivers who are just primarily only wide receivers that catch the ball deep. Like a Marvin Mims on the Denver Broncos probably has a very similar route tree because the only targets he's ever given are, 50 yards down the field. Nonetheless, Courtland Sutton, with this overall opportunity, still made himself a great overall performance of 14.7 fantasy points, 2 catches, 77 yards, and a receiving touchdown. He has scored 1 receiving touchdown in 10 of the last 12 games. That's 83% of the time he's scoring a touchdown thus far this season. Very similar to guys like, Mike Evans, but he just doesn't have the upside of Mike Evans. He's not going to get himself double-digit targets, 8+ receptions within a given week, over 150 receiving yards. He's not going to have the upside, but he's a discount version of Mike Evans. And we'll take that every single week. This week, they take on the Los Angeles Chargers. I'm expecting another big performance here out of Courtland Sutton. On number 20 for this week is Jaylen Waddle. Jaylen Waddle, when you're associated with such an elite offense, you would assume he's going to have himself productive weeks every single week, but it's not the case. When you have Tyreek Hill scoring 2 touchdowns, Raheem Mostert scores a rushing touchdown at the end of the first half. They're up 31-7 at that point. They had a pick 6 in that overall game. On top of it, in the second half, you're running the clock out with Devon Chan. There's no opportunities for Jaylen Waddle. You would hope that he can score early in this game or early enough to where whatever happens in the second half doesn't matter. But you just have to hope that that's going to be the case. Going up against the Tennessee Titans this week, that's the 10th best matchup at the position. They're allowing 29.11 fantasy points per game since week 5 to opposing wide receivers. But again, he's being overshadowed by the fact that Tyreek Hill exists and the running backs of this team continue to find success. We just have to hope that he can find the end zone early or enough yardage to be able to suffice within a given week. Moving on to our number 21, we have Zay Flowers. In the last 2 games in which Zay Flowers has played without Mark Andrews, going back to week 12 against the Los Angeles Chargers, in that game, 8 targets, 5 catches, 25 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown, 1 rushing attempt for 37 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown, 20.7 fantasy points, was able to get himself 25% of the target share within a given game. But even when we go back to week 1, in the absence of Mark Andrews, who was dealing with an injury throughout that game, we saw Zay Flowers, 10 targets, 9 catches, 78, 13.2 fantasy points. I'm expecting this wide receiver to be double digits every single week in the absence of Mark Andrews going forward. I'm expecting him to have another huge performance here against the Los Angeles Rams as one of the best teams in the AFC. Moving on to our number 22, speaking of the Los Angeles Rams, we have number 22, Puka Nacua, and number 23, Cooper Kupp. I want to keep them in the same overall kind of conversation because, again, where one goes, the other probably follows, especially in terms of their overall success. But currently, I have Puka Nacua ahead of Cooper Kupp for the first time in a while. Puka Nacua, obviously getting himself a 70-yard receiving touchdown makes a huge difference, but also continues to play significantly better than Cooper Kupp in a lot of the overall scenarios that we have seen over the course of the last, 6 weeks here. We've seen far more great performances out of Puka Nacua than the opposite side of Cooper Kupp. And I understand that Cooper Kupp's been dealing with his own injuries, but so is Puka Nacua, but he's still battled through them. Puka Nacua going against the Baltimore Ravens this week, it is a very difficult matchup. I'm expecting him to get his fair share of overall targets, considering how well a guy like Matthew Stafford has played over the course of the last 2 games. 7 total touchdowns in the last 2 games. I'm hoping for this offense to continue their momentum. Now, when we talk about the potential of Cooper Kupp, he truly does have the more advantageous matchup, primarily because we have seen slot receiving options against this defense find a lot of success as of late. Most recently, Keenan Allen, 14 catches, 106 against the Baltimore Ravens. Amon-Ra St. Brown, 13 catches, 102. Again, the primary slot wide receivers against these defenses find a lot of success. Puka Nacua playing about 81% of his overall offensive snaps on the outside in comparison to Cooper Kupp, who has been the primary slot receiving option within this offense. Should both have themselves a pretty solid week, but again, the tough matchup against the Baltimore Ravens maybe leads to a negative game script and a lot of production, or could lead to both of them not having great overall days within a given week. Moving on to our number 24, we have Christian Watson. Like I've talked about earlier, rankings are subject to change. Between now and Sunday, if Christian Watson's healthy, he's going to be higher ranked than number 24. But I have him here just precautionary because I don't know exactly how serious that hamstring injury is and if he's going to miss time. If you guys remember, earlier this season, missed weeks 1 through 3 with a hamstring injury. So if in fact this injury is going to be very similar and it's going to hold him out for a extended period of time, then he won't be ranked, and we'll have to adjust accordingly and increase the rankings of guys like Jayden Reed and Romeo Doubs. But if in fact he's available to play and it's not that serious of an injury and he has the potential of continuing his success, he has scored 4 receiving touchdowns in the last 3 games. He is slowly ramping up in terms of targets. The last 3 games, 4 targets, 7 targets, 9 targets. As long as he continues to move forward, averaging 17.07 fantasy points per game in the last 3 games, the momentum is all there for Christian Watson to continue to succeed and especially going up against the New York Giants, a top 5 matchup at the position for wide receivers, should be a solid week. Moving on to our number 25, we have DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins has played very well as of late, primarily because he has scored touchdowns. Outside of the touchdowns, again, Will Levis thus far this season has demonstrated on multiple occasions he's not the best quarterback, but he's a young rookie quarterback. He's getting better every single week, and as long as he continues to look in the direction of DeAndre Hopkins 10 plus times every single game, we're going to find success. Again, just this last week against the Indianapolis Colts was giving him 12 total targets of opportunity. That's all we can ask for. Give your best receiver double-digit targets, and the rest will go ahead and fall into place. As long as DeAndre Hopkins is given this level of opportunity, has red zone upside, taking on the Miami Dolphins, it should be a negative game script. He's had himself his fair share of wars against guys like Jalen Ramsey. Should be an exciting game for the wide receiver. Moving on to Brandin Cooks, our number 26. Speaking of scoring touchdowns, I mentioned it yesterday with guys like Tony Pollard. Touchdowns cure everything. And in the case of, Brandin Cooks, who started out this season playing horribly, not putting up great performances, but as of late, in the last 7 games, 5 receiving touchdowns. That's really all that matters. You score touchdowns, you're going to be fantasy relevant, and that's the fact of the matter. Now, going into this week, it's just a matter of can he continue that momentum in a matchup in which earlier this season, he didn't find much success. Week 9 against the Philadelphia Eagles, 2 targets, 1 catch, 7 yards, 1.2 fantasy points, in a game in which I thought he would have himself an explosive performance. Just to give you a reminder, wide receivers against this defense as of late have been dominating. They're the most advantageous matchup. Most recently, San Francisco 49ers wide receivers, 12 catches, 206, 4 touchdowns in Sunday's game. Buffalo Bills wide receivers, 15 catches, 226, and 2 touchdowns. In the game in Week 9 against the Philadelphia Eagles, in which, of course, Brandin Cooks was a no-show, Jalen Tolbert, 3 catches, 49 and a touchdown. Kevontae Turpin, 1 catch, 5 yards, 1 receiving touchdown. The other receivers were catching the touchdowns. I'm expecting Brandin Cooks to go ahead, have himself a huge performance here against a division rival in a game in which should be a shootout against the Philadelphia Eagles. Moving on to our number 27, we have Garrett Wilson. Considering they have gone ahead and fired Tim Boyle now, he has been released, and that Zach Wilson is back to being the starting quarterback, I'm expecting Garrett Wilson to get back to his normal self. Prior to Zach Wilson being relieved of the starting duties of the New York Jets quarterback job, since Week 4, he had targeted Garrett Wilson 11.57 times per game on average. As long as he's continuing to give him opportunity, it's going to lead to success. Many of those games leading to 80-plus receiving yards on a consistent basis. What we won't find with Garrett Wilson and Zach Wilson is touchdown upside. Pretty much little to no upside at all in that overall category. If we were to end up having a touchdown, it's a miracle. Either way, in terms of just receptions or receiving yards isolated against the Houston Texans, which is an advantageous matchup, I'm expecting Garrett Wilson to have himself a solid performance here. Moving on to our number 28, we have Rashee Rice. Rashee Rice, in the last 2 games, has had great performances, 8 receptions minimum in the last 2 games. Like we heard a couple weeks back from Andy Reid, he specifically said that Rashee Rice is becoming more Patrick Mahomes friendly. And I don't know what that exactly means, but he's gotten himself 8+ catches in each of the last 2 games. And as long as that's going to continue to stay consistent, he is going to be a starting wide receiver. Last week, against, of course, the Green Bay Packers Sunday Night Football, he played a season-high 69% of his overall offensive snaps. Even though that's not a very high percentage, 70% isn't great for a wide receiver. Typically, a starting wide receiver is close to 85, 90+%. Hopefully, the number is only going to increase, even regardless of the fact that he doesn't play 85+ of the overall opportunities. Still gets himself 9 targets, 8 catches, 64 this last week. A lot of opportunity is going to lead to success for Rashee Rice. Moving on to our number 29, we have Gabe Davis. Now, here's the thing about Gabe Davis. You have to understand that he is very volatile as a wide receiver. We know this. Just looking at his most recent performances, since Week 5, he has had 4 games of less than 2 fantasy points and a half PPR and 3 games of over 19 fantasy points. Okay? Just putting that into perspective. Now, going into this week, they take on the Kansas City Chiefs. Luckily for Gabe Davis, he has a history against this defense of playing extremely well. Going back to last season, regular season, 3 catches, 74 and a touchdown. You go back to the playoff game a couple years back against the Kansas City Chiefs, 8 catches, 201, 4 touchdowns. There is potential here for Gabe Davis to continue his momentum and put together a solid performance for this offense. Moving on to our number 30, we have Diontae Johnson. I understand that many of you may be skeptical on Mitchell Trubisky's overall potential, but he is going to allow Diontae Johnson to be a solid overall performer, especially in the absence of Matt Canada. When we go ahead and look at the last 5 games in which Mitchell Trubisky started in 2022, in those games, Diontae Johnson averaging 10.2 targets, 7.4 receptions, 75.2 receiving yards, and 11.66 half PPR fantasy points per game. The Patriots, they're the 8th best matchup at the wide receiver position. I'm anticipating for Diontae Johnson to have himself a solid performance. And if we just look back to last week's performance in the absence of Kenny Pickett, of course, Diontae Johnson scored a receiving touchdown. Hopefully he can continue that momentum going into this week. On number 31 is Drake London, coming off a lackluster performance of 1 catch, 8 yards, 5 targets against the Jets. Are we surprised? No. The New York Jets are a solid secondary, and when you have a quarterback like Desmond Ridder, it doesn't really bode well for you. Now, this week they take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They are the third best matchup at the position, allowing 33.71 fantasy points per game on average to opposing wide receivers. And we know on the Atlanta Falcons, outside of Drake London, there aren't any other wide receivers catching the ball. So if you go back to week 7 in that game, 7 targets, 6 catches, 54 receiving yards, 8.4 fantasy points. But as we all remember, if you do, he reached for the pylon, fumbled out the back of the end zone, and unfortunately, a touchdown was taken off of the board. There was a potential for Drake London to have himself 15 plus fantasy points last time out against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We got to hope that he could put that together this week. Most recently, wide receivers against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Michael Pittman Jr., 10 catches for 107. Brandin Aiyuk, 5 catches for 156 and a touchdown. Tank Dell, 6 catches, 114, 2 touchdowns. Hopefully, Drake London could put together a great performance here. Our number 32 is Chris Godwin. We've heard it on multiple occasions, not only earlier today, from head coach Todd Bowles, that they want to get more utilization out of Chris Godwin. He said specifically, we've seen a lot of, of the receiving work go in the direction of Mike Evans. We want to keep that intact, but we also want to get far more utilization in the direction of Chris Godwin. Even going back to last week, offensive coordinator Dave Canales said, we got to get the ball and we need to design plays for Chris Godwin to get momentum. With the entire coaching staff on the same page of getting Chris Godwin the ball, expect him to get the ball this week against the Atlanta Falcons defense. He's coming off a performance from last week against the Carolina Panthers where he saved his overall performance because he only had 3 targets, 0 receptions, but was able to get himself a jet sweep rushing attempt for 19 yards and a rushing touchdown. Saved this week with that overall opportunity, but going forward, expect him to get far more touches within this offense. Moving on to our number 33, we have Elijah Moore. In the absence and the assumption that, of course, Amari Cooper misses due to the concussion protocol, I'm expecting Elijah Moore to continue to be the number 1 receiving option of this offense. Now, as you guys can tell from the chart on the right side of the screen, the opportunity was there. 12 total targets, was only able to make 4 total receptions on those overall opportunities. But as Joe Flacco continues to get first team snaps, as this rapport continues to build between these two players, the wide receiver and quarterback, again, you got to remember they played together in New York last season. As long as the momentum continues to build between these two and the rapport continues to build, they take on the 5th best matchup at the position, taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars. I'm anticipating Elijah Moore to continue to be the number 1 receiving option of this offense in the absence of Amari Cooper. On number 34 is Jaxon Smith-Njigba. We heard a couple weeks back Pete Carroll say enthusiastically that the Seattle Seahawks wanted to get more utilization out of JSN. And that's exactly what they did. Going back to Thursday night's game against the Dallas Cowboys, a season-high, career high of 11 targets, 7 catches. As long as the desire of Pete Carroll and, of course, the offensive coordinator continue to focus on the idea of getting the ball in the direction of their rookie wide receiver, Jaxon Smith-Njigba, it's going to continue to lead to success. Tyler Lockett obviously has been inconsistent, and, of course, DK Metcalf is the de facto number 1 of this offense, but as long as Jaxon Smith-Njigba is given this level of opportunity, it's going to lead to success. I mean, just as last week against the Dallas Cowboys, had a touchdown taken off the board because they assumed that his hand wasn't under the ball. It looked like a touchdown to me. He should have had himself 15 plus fantasy points. Nonetheless, I'm expecting him and the momentum to continue to go in his direction because the target opportunity is going to be there. Moving on to our number 35, we have Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley, man, I mean, as soon as Christian Kirk went down, the entire game fell apart for that offense in terms of passing. Trevor Lawrence was looking towards guys that I didn't even know the names of. I'll be totally honest. And Calvin Ridley obviously was ignored. He had a couple opportunities here and there that he dropped, or there was a penalty that called back. I mean, this was like 80 yards worth of penalties and drops that Calvin Ridley had. Should have had himself over 100 receiving yards within the given game. Nonetheless, they take on the Cleveland Browns. The reason why I have him at number 35 is because Denzel Ward is back. I am deathly afraid of wide receivers against Denzel Ward. Therefore, Calvin Ridley sits here. And of course, we still don't know if Trevor Lawrence is playing. Our number 36 is Jakobi Meyers. The last time out that we saw him, they took on the Kansas City Chiefs in that game. Jakobi Meyers, 7 targets, 6 catches, 79 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown, nearly 17 fantasy points. If we can get far more utilization out of Jakobi Meyers, it's not only going to make it easier for this team to run the ball, it's not only going to make it easier for Davante Adams to find himself, in less double coverage situations, but it'll also give us another fantasy option that we can trust on a given basis at the wide receiver position. We have seen him play very well this season when given opportunity. As long as Aiden O'Connell continues to send the ball in the direction of Jakobi Meyers, he's a starting option going into this week. Moving on to our number 37, Tyler Lockett. Like I mentioned just moments ago with JSN, Tyler Lockett, very inconsistent. He's going to have himself explosive performances. He's going to have himself lackluster performances. I mean, just looking back at last week's game against the Dallas Cowboys, he ran a post route, wide open, drops the ball. If he catches that pass, he scores a touchdown. Either way, it's not out of the realm of possibility for on one singular play, Tyler Lockett could go ahead and make his entire fantasy week. Moving on to our number 38, we have Adam Thielen. I talked about it on Monday. I said that the Adam Thielen project was over and that Jonathan Mingo was going to take over. I want to still hope and just leave out some hope that Adam Thielen can continue to be the number one of this offense. I understand he has only had 9 targets in the last 2 games, but if you look at the last 10 games in which Adam Thielen has played with Bryce Young, 6 of those 10 games, double-digit targets. I'm going to hope that he's going to continue to get the ball sent in his direction. Last week, was given a target in the red zone, was tackled down at the 1-yard line. The following play, Chuba Hubbard scores a touchdown. Very close to scoring a touchdown. And the New Orleans Saints secondary definitely dealing with a lot of injuries and have been victim to giving up a lot of receiving yards to opposing slot wide receiver options. Jasir Taylor definitely struggling in that overall circumstance. And of course, Marshawn Lattimore dealing with the injured reserve stint that he's on. Moving on to our number 39, we have Jayden Reed. I understand the Jayden Reed's performance, very lackluster, 4 catches for only 16 yards. But you got to understand that this offense is going to continue to score touchdowns. And as long as that is in the realm of possibility, Jayden Reed could potentially score a touchdown, especially going up against the Giants, which is the 4th best matchup at the position. This is the first game in a while in which he hasn't scored double-digit fantasy points. So I'm going to give him some slack. I'm going to assume that he'll get back on track this week in an advantageous matchup. The final wide receiver I wanted to talk about is Josh Downs. They take on the Cincinnati Bengals. The Bengals are the 11th best matchup at the position. They're allowing 28.4 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Michael Pittman Jr. is going to pull his primary coverage, maybe double coverage. And once, in fact, that takes place, outside of the performance in which we saw Alec Pierce this last week have himself, 3 catches for 100 yards and a touchdown, majority of the overall targets will be going in the direction of Josh Downs. I'm anticipating that to be the case, and of course for him to have himself a solid performance here as my number 40. All right, that's going to cover for me today. Thank you everybody for watching. I appreciate all the support. If you guys haven't yet already, click the like button down below. Subscribe if you haven't yet already. I'll be back tomorrow with quarterback and tight end rankings. Much love, greatly appreciate it. And until next time, guys, I'll see you. Peace.